All right. So the next two parts of my proposed plan have a common theme, which is corporate control and corporate influence. And this is going to be a tough one to get through, um, not only to talk about, but also to implement. I'd imagine this one's going to get the most pushback. This, along with reducing the defense, because there's so much influence and money involved. But I'll get into it. So this one, I'll say this part of it. I'll say is corporate influence, which covers a few different things, and then the next one will be affordability and addressing prices and affordability issues, which ultimately are driven by corporate influence. So these two kind of tie into each other. This one will focus specifically on corporate influence. So if you're familiar with some of the history here, around the 1970s, there was a concerted effort by certain private figures, government officials, to influence the US public about the importance of supporting corporations and to create an agenda within the federal government to cater to corporate interests and influence government policy in favor of corporations. And they've worked on that for decades. It's gone from the 70s. Each decade has made more progress until we're where we're at today at this extreme position. I can, in later videos that I do, I can give more detail and link to specific references. But in these intro videos, I'm trying to keep it concise. But there's a lot of material behind all this. In sum, I think we can all agree right now that healthy companies are in the US is an important thing and we all benefit from that. But I think we also agree that it's gone too far. I don't think any of us would I don't think any of us, of the public or individuals, would say, oh, if only corporations had more influence, had more power, more control over our lives, more control over the government, things would be even better than they are now. I think the majority of people out there feel contrary, that it's gone too far and they have too much influence and too much control, specifically over the government. So I think this is one of these things, one of these 10 things that I'm trying to say we can all rally around and all come together to say that this is the agenda that we want. Um, so there's two aspects to this that I'm trying to focus on in terms of limiting corporate influence. The first one is obviously corporate lobbying. Um, it's clear that Congress is occupied by corporate interests and foreign interests, I'll say, by these lobbying groups and PACs. And most of you are probably aware of the case a few years ago, Citizens United, which just opened the floodgates to say that these organizations are free to operate essentially as individuals do. And again, I think this is one of I think very few individuals would agree with that position. And all it's done is make things even more extreme, to the extent of influence that corporations have over Congress, to the point that that I feel that Congress no longer serves the people. It's serving these corporate interests, large lobbyists, and foreign interest lobby groups. That's the first part of it, is how do you tackle that? And then the second part of this, I would say, is antitrust. Antitrust is the idea that corporations have too much influence over a specific market. But I think it's broader than that. It's clear that the size of these corporations now are a problem. The number of enormous corporations in products, services, and the media are, like, over the last, from just the decades from when I was born to today, everything is consolidated into these number of small number of very large corporations that the larger they get, they don't only have control over pricing to individuals and markets and employment of people, but it also gives them greater control over Congress. It's easier for them to control the government if there are mega corporations, a few mega corporations all endorsing candidates or all paying candidates, and this sort of thing. So if we reduce the size of these companies, reduce the size the size of the influence, it would give them less pricing power, give people more job options, and give them less control over the government. So I see this as two aspects to make some progress on this. My goal in these two parts of this specific corporate control plan is to try to reverse the trend of corporate control back towards less corporate control and corporate influence and more individual control of the government. So what I propose to do this? Number one is to eliminate corporate lobbying, and I'll throw in there also, in addition to corporate lobbying, I'll throw in foreign lobbying. They're both equally bad. So I would say either directly or indirectly or through PACs, no more organizational corporate and foreign lobbying. And this is a tough one to crack because of that case that I mentioned, Citizens United. This maybe could be done through an act of Congress, through legislation, or it may require a constitutional amendment. This is not something that the president can take on themselves or the executive branch can take on. It has to go through Congress. That's what makes this so difficult. But this is just another example where to make any progress on this, you have to take a step, and the step has to be the next president needs to propose legislation to Congress to say this is what the people want. They want an elimination of corporate lobbying, PACs, foreign lobbying. This just needs to be eliminated. Here's the proposed legislation, or here's the proposed amendment. And the vast majority of the country all want this. And then if they refuse to implement it, then it's a mask-off moment of who's working against your interests and what you want and what the people want. And they're only representing corporate interests and foreign interest to the detriment of the individual voters at that point. Then it's clear who they serve. So I would propose to do that in the first year. I think that's an important step to rolling a lot of this back. Point two, and the good news here is that was the bad news. The good news is the second one is wholly within the control of the president, of what to do about corporate sizes and to break up the shares of markets that they have. Antitrust enforcement and corporate size issues and market influence issues, it's been eroded over decades. They've tried to work to allow these large corporations and not enforce antitrust. But again, the good news is this is all within the executive branch, and this all ties into affordability in the next part of the plan, by the way. If you reduce the size of these companies, give them less influence, it will improve affordability. So we'll get there next. But how do you do this? How do you do that? It's all within the control of two parts of the executive branch: the FTC and the DOJ. The next president needs to set them on the task of reducing the influence of these companies, breaking up these companies. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, you have you have some financial companies or asset management companies. You've probably all heard of BlackRock. They have outsized influence over the economy and over companies, and then ultimately over Congress. How did they get that outsized influence? It's really interesting because they actually got that through like leveraging assets that have been pooled. So people, give these companies like BlackRock, State Street, Goldman Sachs, Fidelity, Vanguard. They put their assets in there to be managed and invested for retirement and whatever. And then these companies take all those assets and invest them in things that they want to control. So, for example, if you take that much money, even though BlackRock doesn't own it itself, it takes it and buys a significant stake in a corporation. They then have voting control over that corporation, even though BlackRock itself doesn't own it. They've taken so many pooled assets that they have a controlling stake of those companies, and so on with all these companies. And they have used that for bad purposes. For example, to buy housing companies, to buy individual residential housing, to buy stakes in residential housing and apartments, so that they then have control over those markets. And that's part of the affordability of houses problem. They're working on utilities. If they find a utility market that is primed to raise prices on, they look at a specific utility market and they say, oh, there's only a couple companies working in that area. We could easily raise utility prices if we just had control over that company. They go in and buy a controlling stake of that company. They're working on utilities. They're working on water control. All these things. They're trying to control, manipulate, and get influence over those markets through the pooled resources. To buy the numbers, the top 8 financial firms, asset management firms have 42 trillion in assets under control. Total U.S. market for securities is 62 trillion. The top 8 companies control 42 of the 62 trillion. That's a majority control of the entire market just by these 8 companies. And if you want to look further into the world, so China is 11 trillion, Japan is 6 trillion. They still have more than half of all that. So they own control. They've been able to gain controlling influence over the markets and over individual markets and sectors like utilities and housing in the U.S. and things like that. So again, back to what do you do about that? You set the FTC and the DOJ on the task of enforcing new antitrust standards that are much higher. So, for example, you would say, I would say, these asset management companies can't control more than 1 trillion in assets per company. Once you hit 1 trillion in assets, you're doing great, good work. Now you need to let another company control another pool of assets. We can't have one company like BlackRock with 10 trillion under control. Let's limit it to 1 trillion and say that that's a fair market for that. 1 trillion is a huge amount in itself. What else? These asset management companies can't own critical infrastructure that's required to live. They can't invest in utilities like power and water. They just can't. If you want to invest in individual securities or companies, that's great. You can't get controlling interest over utilities. Housing, you can't own housing anymore. You can't own health services. Going back to healthcare affordability that I talked about a while back. Food, either upstream food or downstream food. I'll talk about that in the next part of the plan. But that's part of the reason that food costs are so high is because there's controlling interest on both sides of food, the inputs to farmers and how it gets distributed. And then also other things. So in general, so those are some of the critical points, but also other things like breaking up just large companies that don't need to be the size that they are and can be broken up into smaller segments and still function healthy within the country. That's good for the society. It's good for people to have a little bit smaller companies that are under control. An example of that is, if you want to have giant control over something like toys, that's great, but you can't do things you can't have controlling interest over things that are critical that people need to live. That just it's not healthy. It doesn't make sense. Another example of that is when I was a kid, there were dozens of news and media outlets. They have been consolidated. I'm sure you've seen different stories where they've consolidated now into 6 companies. There's 6 companies that control all the different media outlets. It's easy to control, easy to manipulate, not healthy, would break that up as well. That's just not good. So first year, put the FTC and the DOJ onto a new path that we're holding much higher enforcement standards to break up this influence in companies. That would be the new mission.